My father left my mother for a woman he called holy, a pastor, a woman everyone in Chicago respected, trusted, and called a servant of God. I spent 15 years hating her for destroying my family, for turning my mother into someone who smiled with broken eyes. Then I met the man I was sure I would marry. He was kind, brilliant, and the first person who ever made love feel safe. I said yes when he proposed. But the night he took me home to meet his mother, the front door opened, and there she was. The woman I had hated my entire life, my father's pastor, my family's ruin, and my future mother-in-law. That was the night revenge stopped being simple. I was 17 years old the night my father walked out of our house in Boston with one suitcase in his hand, and a sentence that split my life in two. Until that night, I still believed families could bend without breaking. I still believed my mother and I were enough to keep him home. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon, roasted turkey, and the shortbread cookies my mother only made on Christmas Eve. Snow pressed softly against the windows, and the yellow lights from the tree made everything look warmer than it really was. My mother stood by the sink, drying the same plate over and over again, because her hands needed something to do. My father stood near the front door wearing his gray winter coat, looking less like a man leaving and more like a man who had already left months before. His name was Thomas Carter, and for most of my childhood, I thought he was the strongest man in the world. He owned a small real estate business, shook hands like contracts were sacred, and believed every problem could be solved with discipline, hard work, and silence. At dinner, he sat at the head of the table as if the chair had been built around him. My mother, Helen, was softer in every way, a former elementary school teacher who folded love into everything she touched. She remembered birthdays, packed lunches, ironed shirts, wrote thank you cards, and forgave people before they even apologized. I was their only daughter, Olivia Carter, the girl who used to think a family was something permanent. That night taught me permanence was just a word adults used until they found something they wanted more. The change in my father did not happen all at once. It came slowly, like a crack spreading beneath fresh paint. First, he started taking business trips to Chicago, that lasted longer than they needed to. Then he began attending services at a large evangelical church there, even though we had never been especially religious. He came home talking about faith, renewal, purpose, and surrender, words that sounded holy until I saw what they were doing to my mother. One name came up more than all the others: Pastor Rebecca Hayes. He said her sermons made him feel seen, that she understood broken men, that she had a way of speaking directly to the soul. My mother would smile tightly whenever he said her name, but I could see her fingers tense around her coffee mug. By Thanksgiving that year, my father had become a guest in his own house. He still slept under our roof, but emotionally he had moved out long before the suitcase appeared. He stopped asking about my college applications. He stopped kissing my mother on the forehead before leaving for work. He took phone calls in the garage and returned with that distant calm people have when they have already justified hurting someone. I remember once walking past his office and hearing him say, "I feel more peace there than I have felt here in years." I did not know who was on the other end of the line, but I knew my mother heard it too. She was standing in the hallway behind me, barefoot, holding a basket of folded towels like they were the only thing keeping her upright. On Christmas Eve, my mother tried to pretend everything was normal. She set the table for 3, lit candles, played old holiday music, and asked me to help arrange the cookies on a plate. I wanted to scream at her to stop acting like a little more warmth could save a freezing house. But I did not scream, because children of unhappy marriages learn early that silence feels safer than truth. My father barely ate dinner. He cut his turkey into small pieces, moved them around the plate, and checked his phone twice under the table. When my mother asked if he wanted coffee, he said no with a gentleness that felt more cruel than anger. Then he stood up and said he needed to talk. He did not look at me first. He looked at my mother, as if I were not part of the family he was about to abandon. He said he had been unhappy for a long time. He said he had found clarity through the church in Chicago. He said Pastor Rebecca had helped him understand that God sometimes calls people out of places where their spirit is dying. My mother did not move. I watched her face carefully, waiting for tears, but none came. She only asked one question, quiet and simple. "Are you leaving us for her?" My father closed his eyes for half a second, and that was all the answer I needed. Then he said the sentence I would remember for the rest of my life. "I found peace where this house could never give me." He said it like a confession, but it landed like a knife. My mother flinched as if he had slapped her. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor, and for the first time in my life, I looked at my father and hated him. Not disliked him, not resented him, hated him with the clean force of a daughter watching her mother be reduced to a failure in her own kitchen. He tried to tell me it was complicated. I told him there was nothing complicated about a man choosing another woman over his family. He picked up his suitcase, and the Christmas lights reflected in the metal zipper as he walked toward the door. I followed him to the porch, barefoot in the cold, because some part of me still believed he would turn around if I made him see me. The snow was falling harder by then, covering the steps and the hood of his car. He put the suitcase in the trunk and finally looked at me. For 1 second, he looked ashamed. That 1 second would make me angrier than anything else, because shame meant he knew exactly what he was doing. I asked him if Pastor Rebecca knew he was leaving his wife and daughter on Christmas Eve. He did not answer. He only said, "Olivia, one day you will understand that people have to choose the life that saves them." I told him I hoped his new life buried him alive. I still remember the way his face changed when I said it. Not hurt, exactly. More surprised that I was capable of being cruel. But cruelty is not born from nothing. It grows in the place where trust used to live. He got in the car and drove away slowly, his taillights disappearing into the snow like two red wounds closing in the dark. I stood there until my feet went numb, because going back inside meant seeing what he had left behind. When I returned to the kitchen, my mother was sitting at the table with both hands folded in front of her. The candles had burned low, and the food had gone cold. She looked smaller than she had an hour before, as if my father had taken some invisible part of her with him. I waited for her to cry, to curse him, to curse Rebecca Hayes, to say anything that sounded like anger. Instead, she looked at me and said, "You should put on socks, sweetheart." That broke me more than screaming would have. Because even while her own heart was collapsing, she was still trying to take care of mine. That night, I learned 3 things. I learned that a man could dress selfishness in spiritual language and call it salvation. I learned that a woman could be destroyed quietly and still ask if her daughter was cold. And I learned the name Rebecca Hayes, a name I would carry like poison for the next 15 years. In my mind, she became the woman who took my father, the pastor who preached forgiveness while standing on the wreckage of my mother's marriage. I did not care what she looked like, what she believed, or how many people called her holy. To me, she was the reason my mother stopped humming in the kitchen. She was the reason Christmas never smelled the same again. After my father left, people expected us to fall apart loudly, but we did not. My mother went back to work within a week. I finished high school with perfect grades and a face so controlled that teachers called me mature. Mature is what adults call children who have learned not to need anything. I got into college, then law school, and I built myself into the kind of woman who could survive betrayal before it happened. I studied family law because I wanted to understand how people could stand in court and divide a life into assets, custody, support, and signatures. I told myself I was helping other women avoid becoming my mother. But the truth was uglier. Every case was another way to put men like my father, and women like Rebecca Hayes, on trial. For 15 years, I did not see Rebecca in person, but she lived in my head like a verdict waiting to be delivered. I saw her name online sometimes, attached to sermons, charity events, church conferences, and smiling photos with people who called her compassionate. Pastor Rebecca Hayes of Chicago, a woman of faith, a leader, a voice of healing. Healing. That word made me sick. I wanted to ask her followers if they knew what kind of healing required a daughter to watch her mother age 10 years in one winter. I wanted to stand in the back of her church and tell everyone that holiness meant nothing if it could not recognize the blood on its own hands, but I never did. I kept my anger clean, private, and sharp. By the time I turned 31, I had become exactly the woman I thought I needed to be. Olivia Carter, attorney, controlled, respected, impossible to intimidate. I did not beg people to stay. I did not chase explanations. I did not forgive easily, because forgiveness sounded too much like letting guilty people sleep well. My mother used to tell me that hatred was a heavy thing to carry. I told her I was strong enough. And for years, I believed that was true. Then I met Ethan Hayes. And for the first time since the night my father left, I began to wonder if love was not always another word for abandonment. By the time I met Ethan Hayes, I had spent 14 years turning myself into a woman no one could easily hurt. I lived in Boston in a quiet apartment overlooking a street lined with old brick buildings and stubborn little trees that survived every winter like they had something to prove. I worked too much, slept too little, and measured people by how quickly they disappointed me. My clients called me sharp. Opposing counsel called me difficult. My mother called me lonely, though she said it gently, like loneliness was a weather pattern instead of a choice. I told her I was fine because fine was easier than explaining that peace and distance often look exactly the same. Family law had a way of stripping romance down to its bones. Every day I sat across from people who once promised forever and now argued over retirement accounts, custody schedules, and who got to keep the dog. Love, in my office, arrived in cardboard boxes and left in signed settlements. I was good at it because I understood resentment better than reconciliation. I knew what betrayal looked like long before most people admitted it to themselves. I could hear it in the way a husband said technically or the way a wife said actually. My job was not to save marriages. My job was to help people survive the wreckage. The case that brought Ethan into my life started with a medical proxy dispute at St. Vincent Memorial Hospital. A wealthy family was fighting over an elderly man on life support, and my client was the daughter who believed her father's wishes were being ignored by a son who cared more about inheritance than dignity. It was ugly, emotional, and exactly the kind of case that made everyone in the room believe they were the hero. Ethan was not supposed to be central to it. He was the attending cardiothoracic surgeon responsible for the patient's care, which meant he became the unwilling witness everyone wanted to weaponize. The first time I saw him, he was standing outside a consultation room in navy scrubs, sleeves rolled to his forearms, speaking to a nurse with the kind of calm that made everyone else lower their voice without realizing it. He was taller than I expected, dark hair slightly messy in a way that suggested exhaustion rather than style, and eyes that looked like they listened before they judged. I hated that I noticed any of it. I introduced myself, and he shook my hand like he had no idea I was already preparing to argue with him. When I asked if he would testify regarding my client's father's previously stated wishes, he said he would testify to the truth, not to strategy. I should have respected that immediately. Instead, I found it irritating. Truth, in legal battles, was rarely clean enough to survive untouched. I told him my client deserved an advocate, not philosophical restraint. He looked at me for a moment, not offended, just measuring. Then he said, "Sometimes advocacy becomes another word for control." I remember blinking because people were usually either intimidated by me or combative. He was neither. He was simply unmoved. 16. I walked away annoyed and, far more dangerously, curious. Over the next few weeks, our paths crossed more often than I liked. Depositions, hospital meetings, family conferences that stretched too long under fluorescent lights. Every time, Ethan remained infuriatingly steady. He did not flirt, did not posture, did not seem impressed by the reputation people kept whispering around me like a warning label. He asked direct questions and expected honest answers. When I snapped once after a 12-hour day and accused him of thinking lawyers were emotional vultures feeding on tragedy, he laughed. Not cruelly, just honestly, like I had surprised him. Then he said, "No, I think you're someone who decided control feels safer than trust." I stared at him because I had known him for maybe 3 weeks and he had just reached further into my life than most people managed in years. My instinct was to shut it down, to turn cold and professional and remind him that my personal life was not available for commentary. Instead, I asked him if he did this with everyone or if I was receiving some special premium service. He smiled then, small and tired and real. Definitely special treatment. That should have been the moment I ran. Instead, it was the moment I started paying attention. The case eventually settled the way most painful things do, with nobody feeling victorious and everyone pretending compromise was closure. My client thanked me with tears in the parking garage. Her brother glared at me like I had personally dismantled his childhood. The patient passed away 2 weeks later, quietly, according to Ethan. I should have never seen him again. That is how these stories are supposed to work. Temporary collision, polite goodbye, everyone returns to the life they had before. But a month later, I ran into him at a bookstore in Cambridge while reaching for the same biography of Thurgood Marshall. We both touched the book at the same time like a badly written romantic comedy, and I almost handed it to him out of pure resistance to cliché. Instead, I said, "If you tell me advocacy is another word for control again, I'm leaving." He laughed and offered to buy me coffee as a peace treaty. I said no. Then I said yes 10 seconds later because apparently my self-preservation had taken the afternoon off. We sat in a coffee shop near Harvard Square for 2 hours talking about everything except the reasons we should not be doing this. He told me he grew up in Chicago, that he hated winter but stayed in Boston because medicine had a way of choosing your geography for you. I told him almost nothing useful, and still somehow felt seen. Ethan was dangerous because he was kind without being performative. He remembered details. He listened to silences instead of rushing to fill them. He asked about my mother and actually waited for the answer. He did not make promises like men in movies. He showed up. When my mother had a minor surgery and I tried to handle everything alone, he left the hospital after a 14-hour shift just to sit with me in the waiting room and make sure I ate something besides vending machine crackers. He did not make a speech about being there for me. He just was. It was unbearable. I spent months trying to convince myself I was imagining it, that I was too old and too rational to be undone by a man who brought me soup when I was sick and remembered how I took my coffee. But love rarely announces itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the form of relief. Relief that someone does what they said they would do. Relief that your phone lighting up no longer means bad news. Relief that for one reckless second, you stop preparing for abandonment and simply exist inside being cared for. That terrified me more than any courtroom ever had. My mother noticed before I admitted it to myself. We were folding laundry in her kitchen one Sunday afternoon when she held up one of my blouses and asked too casually, "So, who is Ethan?" I nearly dropped a towel. Apparently, I had mentioned him 6 times in 20 minutes without realizing it. She smiled in that maddeningly patient way mothers do when they know your heart before you do. I told her he was a doctor and that he was kind, and that I did not trust any of it. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me for a long moment before saying, "Not every man is your father, Olivia. Don't make someone else pay for a wound they didn't create." I wanted to argue, but I could not because she was right and I hated when she was right. My mother had every reason to turn bitterness into religion, and somehow she never did. She rebuilt herself quietly. She taught me strength without revenge, though I was slower to learn that lesson. She met Ethan a month later over dinner and loved him within 20 minutes because he asked her for the recipe to her lemon chicken and actually wrote it down. After he left, she stood at the sink smiling like she was afraid to trust her own happiness. She said, "He looks at you like he's grateful you exist. Don't waste that." I did not waste it. I fell in love instead. It happened fully on a rainy Thursday night in October. I had lost a brutal custody case that I knew was legally correct and morally devastating. I came home furious at the world, at the system, at myself for still caring too much. Ethan was waiting outside my apartment with takeout and that ridiculous patience of his. I told him I was not good company. He said he had not applied for the position. We sat on my kitchen floor eating Thai food out of containers because neither of us felt like finding plates. At some point I started talking, really talking, about my father, about Christmas Eve, about Rebecca Hayes, about how abandonment becomes a language you speak even when nobody else hears it. I had never told a man that story before. I expected pity or anger, or the polite discomfort people wear when trauma becomes too specific. Ethan only listened. When I finished, the apartment was quiet except for rain against the windows. He reached across the floor and took my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then he said 4 words that changed everything. "You deserved better, Olivia." No defense of my father. No lecture about forgiveness. Just truth. Clean and simple. I cried so suddenly it embarrassed me. A month later, he took me to the Boston Public Garden just after sunset, when the city lights made the wet pavement shine like glass. It was freezing, and I kept complaining about my shoes because romance in real life usually involves bad weather and practical irritation. We were walking near the bridge when he stopped. I turned around ready to make another sarcastic comment and found him holding a ring box and shaking hands. For the first time since I had known him, Ethan looked genuinely nervous. He said he knew life was unpredictable and messy and that neither of us were people who believed in fairy tales. But he said love did not have to be a fairy tale to be real. Then he asked me to marry him. I stared at him because some part of me had spent my entire life preparing for people to leave, not stay. Marriage had always felt like a beautiful contract waiting to fail. Yet standing there, looking at this man who had never once asked me to be smaller, softer, or easier to love, I felt something terrifying. Hope. I said yes before fear had time to interrupt. He laughed. I cried again, which was becoming a humiliating pattern, and a stranger walking a dog actually applauded like the universe had decided subtlety was overrated. That night, lying awake beside him, I remember thinking maybe my life had finally outrun my past. Maybe love was not always the beginning of loss. Maybe some doors opened instead of closing. I touched the ring on my hand and let myself imagine a future I had spent years refusing to believe I deserved. A home. A marriage. Something steady, something mine. I did not know that the worst part of my story was not behind me. It was waiting in Chicago, behind the front door of Ethan's childhood home. There are moments in life when the world does not shatter loudly. It breaks in silence, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the second your mind understands something your soul refuses to accept. That was how it happened for me. Not with screaming, not with drama, but with the soft click of a front door opening on a cold Saturday evening in Chicago. I had imagined that dinner so many times on the flight there. I pictured meeting Ethan's mother, smiling politely, making the kind of careful first impression women are taught to perfect. I imagined warmth, awkward laughter, stories about his childhood, maybe old photographs and too much food. I did not imagine meeting the ghost that had been living in my chest for 15 years. Chicago was colder than Boston that weekend, the kind of February cold that makes even expensive neighborhoods look lonely. Ethan drove us from the airport through streets lined with old trees and houses that seemed to carry generations inside their walls. He was relaxed in a way I had not seen before, softer somehow, like coming home peeled something protective off him. He kept reaching over to touch my hand at red lights, smiling like a man who believed he was bringing the woman he loved into the safest part of his world. I smiled back because I loved him enough to want that moment to stay untouched. My engagement ring felt warm against my skin. I remember thinking maybe this was the beginning of the life I had finally earned. His mother lived in a beautiful old house near the church where she preached. A restored brick home with white shutters and a wide porch that looked like something from a magazine about people who knew how to host Christmas correctly. There were warm lights glowing in the windows and fresh flowers near the front steps despite the cold. It looked like the kind of place where people forgave each other over homemade pie and old family recipes. Ethan carried my bag with one hand, and wrapped the other around my waist as we walked to the door. He kissed my forehead and told me not to be nervous because his mother was going to love me. I laughed and told him I cross-examined hostile witnesses for a living. I could survive dinner. He rang the bell. I heard footsteps inside, slow and steady, and then the door opened. For a second, I did not recognize her because memory freezes people at the age of your pain. In my mind, Rebecca Hayes had always been the woman from old church photos and newspaper articles, polished and distant and untouchable. The woman standing in front of me was older now, silver threaded through dark hair, fine lines around her eyes, elegance softened by time. But it was her, Pastor Rebecca Hayes. The woman whose name I had learned to hate before I was old enough to drive. The woman I blamed for every Christmas my mother spent pretending she was not lonely. The woman I had imagined confronting 100 different ways and never once like this. She recognized me too. I saw it happen. Her smile froze before it fully formed. Her eyes moved from Ethan to me, and something passed through her face so quickly most people would have missed it. Shock first, then understanding, then, something heavier. Guilt. Maybe. Or fear. The tray she was holding tilted slightly in her hands before she steadied it. Ethan, completely unaware he had just detonated a bomb in the middle of his own front porch, smiled like a child introducing two people he loves. Mom, this is Olivia. Olivia, my mother, Rebecca. My body forgot how to move. I think I said hello. I am not sure. My voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone standing behind me. Rebecca said my name softly, too softly, and that was somehow worse than if she had denied knowing me. She knew exactly who I was. I could see my father's betrayal reflected in her recognition. 15 years collapsed into one terrible second. My mother crying quietly in the bathroom so I would not hear. My father's suitcase by the door. Christmas lights and cold turkey and silence. All of it standing on that porch with us. Ethan looked between us, confused. You two know each other? Rebecca opened her mouth, but I answered first because panic makes people honest. Yes. I know exactly who she is. The air changed immediately. Ethan frowned, trying to place a history he had never been told. Rebecca stepped aside and asked us to come in, but I could barely hear her. The hallway behind her looked warm and golden and full of family photographs, and all I could think was that somewhere inside that house were memories built on the ruins of mine. I walked in because leaving immediately would have required more strength than I had in that moment. The walls were lined with framed church events, charity dinners, Ethan in graduation robes, Ethan as a little boy in baseball uniforms. There was a piano in the living room and the smell of rosemary from the kitchen. It was a home, a real one. And I hated that. Dinner was a performance I was losing badly. Rebecca moved through it with the calm of someone used to holding rooms together while they quietly burned. She asked polite questions about Boston, about my work, about my mother. Every word sounded like it had another one hiding behind it. Ethan talked enough for all three of us, telling stories about residency, about our first disastrous coffee date, about how impossible I had been to impress. Normally I would have rolled my eyes and corrected him. That night I barely touched my wine. I could feel Rebecca watching me when Ethan looked away, not with hostility but with the unbearable weight of someone who knows exactly what she represents. Then Ethan did the one thing I was not prepared for. He stood up, walked behind my chair, and kissed the top of my head before saying he was going to get dessert. It was such a small, loving gesture. Ordinary. Casual. The kind of intimacy built by trust instead of drama. Rebecca watched it happen, and when Ethan disappeared into the kitchen, she said quietly, Olivia, I know this must be. Do not. The word came out sharper than I intended, but not sharper than I felt. Her face did not change. I leaned forward and lowered my voice, because I refused to let Ethan hear this first as an explosion. You do not get to stand in front of me in your perfect house and talk about what this must be. You know exactly what this is. She nodded once. Yes. I do. I wanted to throw every year of my mother's pain across that table. I wanted to ask her how many sermons she preached about grace while another woman folded herself smaller trying to survive being left behind. I wanted to ask if she remembered my father's name before or after he destroyed our family for her, but Ethan came back carrying pie, smiling, hopeful, and the sight of him stopped me. Because this was not just about Rebecca anymore. This was about the man I loved standing in the center of a truth sharp enough to cut everyone in reach. I made it through 10 more minutes. Then I stood up and said I needed air. Ethan followed me to the porch immediately, concern replacing confusion. Liv, what happened? Did my mother say something? Are you okay? I looked at him standing there in the cold, this man I loved, this man who had done absolutely nothing wrong, and I realized there was no version of the next conversation that did not hurt him. My chest felt like it was collapsing inward. I wanted to lie. I wanted to say I was overwhelmed, tired, sick, anything temporary and fixable. But lies were what had built this entire disaster. Instead I asked, very quietly, how much do you know about my father? He blinked. Not much. Just that he left when you were young. I nodded because of course he did not know. Why would he? Some people inherit family recipes. Others inherit wreckage. Your mother, I said, my voice shaking now despite how much I hated that. Your mother is the woman he left us for. I watched the sentence hit him. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then that terrible stillness people have when reality rearranges itself in front of them. Ethan looked past me through the front window where Rebecca was standing in the kitchen, motionless, one hand resting on the counter like she needed it for balance. No, he said. Olivia. Yes. He ran a hand through his hair, once, twice, like repetition might produce a different answer. I have never seen him look afraid before that moment. Not in surgery, not in courtrooms, not anywhere. But fear was there now, because love becomes terrifying when it suddenly has a history you did not choose. I should have told you, Rebecca said from the doorway behind us. We both turned. She stood there without her usual composure, no sermon voice, no pastor's calm authority, just a woman who understood that the past had finally arrived to collect what it was owed. I could not breathe in that house another second. I took off my engagement ring before I could stop myself, not because I wanted to end us, but because I needed Ethan to understand the size of the wound standing between us. I placed it in his hand, and the look on his face nearly broke me. I need to leave, I said. Right now. Olivia. Please do not ask me to stay. I walked down those front steps with my entire body shaking. Snow had started falling again, light and silent, just like the night my father left. Some cruelties in life are so precise they almost feel written. I got into the first cab I saw and gave the driver the name of my hotel before I started crying so hard I could not speak. As the city blurred past the window, one thought repeated in my head like a verdict. The woman I had hated for 15 years was not just a ghost from my past. She was my future mother-in-law, and for the first time in my life, revenge no longer felt simple. I did not sleep that night in Chicago. I sat on the edge of a hotel bed with my coat still on, staring at the city lights outside the window and trying to understand how one dinner had managed to reopen wounds I had spent half my life stitching shut. My phone lit up 23 times before sunrise. 12 calls from Ethan, 4 texts from my mother asking if I was all right because apparently heartbreak travels faster than airplanes. 3 missed calls from an unknown Chicago number that I knew belonged to Rebecca without answering. The rest were silence disguised as notifications I could not bring myself to read. I kept replaying the look on Ethan's face when I placed the ring in his hand. I had imagined confronting Rebecca Hayes for 15 years. I had never imagined that Ethan would be standing between us. By morning, anger had replaced shock, and anger at least was familiar. It gave me structure. I booked the earliest flight back to Boston, ignored every message from Ethan, and spent the entire trip staring at the seat in front of me like it had personally offended me. People think heartbreak is dramatic, but most of it is administrative. Canceling plans, avoiding questions, deciding whether to unpack a suitcase or leave it half open because part of you still expects the story to reverse itself. I walked into my apartment and found the sweater Ethan had left on my couch the week before. I sat on the floor holding it like grief had made me 16 again. My mother came over that evening carrying soup and the expression she reserved for disasters she had seen coming long before I admitted they existed. I told her everything. About the front door. About Rebecca. About the ring in Ethan's hand and the way my whole body felt like betrayal had become physical. I expected outrage on my behalf, some fierce maternal confirmation that yes, life was cruel and I was right to burn it all down. Instead, she listened quietly, the way she always did when truth mattered more than comfort. When I finished, she asked only one question. Are you angry because she hurt us, or because loving him makes revenge impossible? I hated the question because it was honest. The answer was both. If Ethan had been anyone else, I would have walked away cleanly. I would have let Rebecca live with the consequences of her past and called it justice. But Ethan was not collateral damage. He was the first person who had ever made love feel safer than distance. Hurting Rebecca would mean hurting him, and suddenly revenge was no longer a straight line. My mother sat beside me on the kitchen floor, and said something I would not understand fully until much later. Sometimes life tests whether you want punishment more than peace. A week passed in silence. Ethan sent messages every day, never demanding, never angry, just there. I am here. Please talk to me. I love you. None of it made the decision easier. I drafted 20 replies and sent none. At work, I buried myself in depositions and custody hearings because other people's chaos was easier than my own. Then on Thursday morning, my assistant knocked on my office door with the expression people wear when they are about to hand you a problem that does not belong to business hours. "There is a woman here asking for you," she said. "She says it is personal." I already knew. Rebecca Hayes was sitting in the reception area of my law firm like a woman waiting for confession. No church clothes, no public grace, no polished authority. Just a dark coat, tired eyes, and the kind of stillness people wear when they know they are entering enemy territory. My staff had clearly recognized her from the news because every assistant within 20 feet had suddenly developed a professional need to organize papers nearby. She stood when she saw me, and for one brief second I saw something I had never associated with her: vulnerability. I told my assistant to hold my calls and led Rebecca into my office. She stood near the window instead of sitting, hands folded tightly in front of her like she was physically restraining herself from choosing the wrong words. I did not offer coffee. Hospitality felt dishonest. For a long moment neither of us spoke, and I realized this was the first time in 15 years I had been alone with the woman I blamed for ruining my family. I expected satisfaction. What I felt was exhaustion. "Why are you here?" I asked. She looked directly at me. "Because my son loves you. Because I owe you the truth, and because I need your help." There it was. Clean. Simple. The words I had imagined hearing in 100 different versions. I need your help. At any other point in my life, that sentence would have tasted like victory. Instead, it made me furious. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You need my help. After 15 years of my mother rebuilding herself from what your existence did to her, after my father walked out and left us to explain his holiness to the neighbors, after I found out the man I was going to marry belongs to your family, now you need my help." Rebecca did not defend herself. She let every word land. The scandal had broken 2 days earlier. Chicago media had picked it up first, then national outlets because public morality always makes excellent entertainment. Pastor Rebecca Hayes, beloved leader of one of the city's largest evangelical churches, accused of misusing charitable funds and covering financial misconduct inside the church board. Headlines do not care about nuance. They care about blood. The board had already begun internal proceedings to remove her. Donors were disappearing. Congregation members were dividing into camps of loyalty and suspicion. Her reputation, built over decades, was being dismantled in 48 hours. And Ethan, by extension, was being dragged down with her. I knew because hospitals are political ecosystems. By the time I read the first article, people were already whispering about him. About conflict of interest. About family corruption. About whether a surgeon from a scandal-stained family should be trusted with people's lives. Reputation is fragile in medicine. It takes years to build, and one headline to poison. Rebecca placed a folder on my desk. Financial statements. Internal board communications. Donation records. I have been accused of moving money through the church foundation for personal use. I did not. Someone inside the board is using old transfers and partial documents to make it look that way. They want me removed before the spring expansion vote. I need legal representation, and the attorney I had withdrew this morning after the press coverage exploded. I did not touch the folder. And you came to me, because you are the best family and crisis attorney in Boston, and because if anyone has reason not to trust me, it is you. I thought honesty was the only currency I had left. That answer should not have impressed me. It did anyway. I opened the file slowly, partly because I needed facts and partly because looking down gave me a moment to breathe. She was right. The accusation was ugly but not airtight. Large charitable transfers, missing context, selective documentation. It looked less like theft, and more like someone building a narrative from fragments. I had seen worse in divorce court by lunch on a Tuesday. If she was innocent, this was not just an attack. It was an execution. And if I chose not to help, it would succeed. I looked up. "Does Ethan know you came here?" Her face changed. "No. He would have stopped me. Because he knows what you are asking." "Yes." Silence again. I stood and walked to the window because I needed distance from her and from myself. Below us, Boston moved like nothing monumental was happening. People crossed streets, bought coffee, argued into phones. Ordinary life continuing while mine rearranged itself again. I thought about Ethan sitting somewhere in Chicago, trying to protect a mother I had spent years wanting to destroy. I thought about my own mother, who had somehow survived betrayal without becoming it. I thought about the ring still sitting in my bedside drawer because I could not decide if keeping it was weakness or hope. You know what the worst part is? I said without turning around. I waited 15 years for a moment like this. I thought if I ever had the power to decide your future, I would feel righteous. I thought revenge would feel clean. Rebecca's voice behind me was quiet. And does it? No. It feels like collateral damage. When I finally turned back, she looked older than she had on that front porch in Chicago. Not weaker. Just human. I hated that too. I opened the folder again and began reading properly. Numbers. Dates. Signatures. Enough smoke to ruin a life, not enough fire to prove guilt. Someone had set this carefully. Someone inside the church wanted her gone and wanted it to look like moral failure instead of ambition. I closed the file. If I take this case, I said, understand something clearly. I am not doing it for you. I am doing it because I love your son, and because I refuse to let innocent people drown just because I know how to hold their head under. Rebecca nodded once, and for the first time, her composure cracked. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. Maybe some women learn the same survival tricks in different houses. That is more grace than I deserve, she said. Maybe, I replied. But grace and forgiveness are not the same thing. She left my office 20 minutes later with no promises except that I would review everything personally. My staff pretended not to stare as she walked through reception. I stood by my desk after the door closed and realized my hands were shaking. Because this was it. After 15 years of hatred, I finally held power over the woman I believed had destroyed my family. And for the first time in my life, I was not sure destruction was what I wanted. I had spent years waiting for the chance to ruin Rebecca Hayes. Now she was the one sitting across from me asking to be saved. And somehow, that was much harder. There is a dangerous kind of silence that comes after you finally get the thing you thought you wanted. For 15 years, I believed justice would arrive wearing the face of Rebecca Hayes asking for help. I imagined satisfaction, vindication, the clean relief of watching someone who hurt my family finally stand where my mother once stood. Instead, I sat alone in my office at midnight with her case file open on my desk and felt nothing that simple. Revenge, I was learning, becomes complicated the moment innocent people stand close enough to get hit by the falling pieces. Ethan was one of those people. And loving him had turned my anger from a weapon into a question. I took the case. Not publicly at first. Quietly. I reviewed every financial transfer, every board vote, every donation ledger, every email chain from the church foundation. Rebecca was right. Someone had built this carefully. Money had been moved, yes, but not stolen. Restricted funds had been temporarily reassigned during an emergency shelter expansion 3 years earlier after a winter storm damaged church housing for homeless families. It had been approved verbally, then never properly documented when the treasurer resigned 6 weeks later. Sloppy, yes. Criminal, no. Someone on the board had waited for the right political moment and turned administrative negligence into moral theater. The man behind most of it was Andrew Collins, vice chair of the church board. A man with perfect teeth and the kind of smile that looked expensive. He had been pushing for leadership transition for over a year, framing it publicly as vision and privately as control. Rebecca stood in the way. She had too much loyalty in the congregation, too much moral authority, too much history. If he could not outvote her, he could discredit her. Churches, like families, are often most dangerous when they start confusing power with righteousness. I flew to Chicago 3 days later for the first formal strategy meeting. Ethan met me outside my hotel, before I had even checked in. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that lives behind the eyes, and cannot be fixed by sleep. For a moment, neither of us moved. There are reunions people imagine with speeches and tears. Ours was quieter. He stepped forward, and I let him hold me like I had been trying not to fall apart for weeks. I did not apologize for leaving. He did not ask me to. Love, when it survives real things, becomes less about explanation and more about who still shows up. We sat in the hotel lounge for 2 hours talking like two people rebuilding a bridge one plank at a time. He told me he had confronted Rebecca after I left Chicago. She had admitted everything she knew about my father, but not enough to answer the real question. Why had she let me hate her for so long? Why had she never reached out? Ethan did not defend her. He only said he knew his mother carried regret like a second religion. I told him regret was not the same as accountability. He nodded because he knew that too. Then he asked the question both of us had been avoiding. Are we still getting married? I looked at him for a long time before answering. I love you. That has not changed. But love is not a shortcut through truth. If we do this, if we build a life together, it has to stand on reality, not silence. No more inherited lies. No more pretending history does not matter because the future feels prettier without it. He reached across the table and took my hand. Then we do it honestly. That was the closest thing to a promise I trusted. The next afternoon, I met Rebecca alone in her church office. It was exactly how I imagined it would be and somehow nothing like it. Shelves of theology books, framed community awards, soft afternoon light through stained glass, and a woman who had spent decades being called a moral compass sitting across from the daughter of the family she helped fracture. She looked tired in a way public scandal creates. Not fragile. Just stripped of performance. I placed the legal folder on her desk. You are innocent of the financial misconduct. She closed her eyes for 1 second, relief and shame moving across her face together. But innocence in one thing does not erase guilt in another, I continued. Before I decide how far I go to protect you, I want the truth. All of it. No pastor answers. No careful language. I want what actually happened with my father. She nodded slowly, like she had known this moment was always coming. Your father came to the church when his business was collapsing, she said. He was angry at everyone. At your mother, at himself, at aging, at failure. Men like that often mistake being witnessed for being loved. I listened to him because that was my job. He started staying after counseling sessions, bringing coffee, finding reasons to remain. I told him repeatedly that what he was building in his head was not real. I said nothing. I wanted facts, not comfort. He told me he was leaving your mother before I even understood how serious his obsession had become. I told him not to. I told him to go home. I told him faith is not an escape hatch for responsibility. But some people only hear permission inside their own desire. I stared at her. Did you love him? No. The answer came without hesitation. Did you ever have an affair with him? No. Did you let the world think you did? That took longer. Yes, she said finally. And that is the part I deserve your anger for. I leaned back in my chair and felt 15 years rearranging themselves inside me. Why? Because by the time I understood how much damage had been done, your father had already turned me into the villain that made his choices easier to live with. If he admitted he left because he was selfish, then he had to live with being the man who abandoned his wife and daughter for nothing noble. If people believed there was another woman, especially one tied to faith and transformation, then he could call it purpose instead of cowardice. She looked down at her hands, and I let him. At first because I thought protecting the church from scandal mattered more than correcting strangers, then because I thought your mother deserved distance from more humiliation. Then because time passed and silence became its own sin. I told myself reopening it would only hurt you more. Truthfully, I was ashamed. And shame makes cowards of decent people. I stood up, because sitting still suddenly felt impossible. Do you understand what that cost us? My mother spent years believing she lost to someone holier, prettier, more necessary. I spent half my life hating the wrong woman because the right man was too weak to carry his own guilt. Her eyes filled but she did not look away. Yes. And there is no version of my apology that repairs that. Good, I said. Because I am not looking for one. That night I drove 2 hours to the Connecticut suburb where my father now lived alone in a house too large for one person and too quiet for innocence. I had not seen him in years except from a distance at unavoidable family funerals where grief made everyone temporarily polite. Time had aged him in ordinary ways. More gray, less certainty in his shoulders. But when he opened the door, I still saw the man standing in our kitchen on Christmas Eve with a suitcase and a lie dressed as salvation. He looked genuinely shocked. Olivia. I walked past him into the house without waiting for permission. Some daughters spend years rehearsing speeches for this moment. I had reduced mine to one question. Why did you let me hate the wrong person for 15 years? He sat down slowly like old guilt had finally become physical weight. For a long time, he said nothing, and I realized silence was still his favorite form of self-protection. Because it was easier, he said at last. I laughed once because honesty can be brutal in its simplicity. Easier for who? For me. There it was. No sermon. No excuses. Just cowardice wearing its own face. He told me everything then, not because he had suddenly become brave, but because age had made lying too expensive to maintain. Rebecca had never been his lover. She had been a witness to his unraveling, and he mistook compassion for permission. When she refused him, he left anyway because returning home meant admitting failure. Letting people believe she was the reason made him feel less monstrous. My mother accepted the version he allowed, because pain often chooses the explanation that hurts most cleanly. And I, 17 and furious, built my entire adulthood on a target he had handed me. When he finished, the room felt smaller. I looked at him and realized something unexpected. I did not hate him in the fiery way I once had. Hatred requires energy. What I felt was colder. Disappointment. So complete, it had become peace. You let another woman carry your sin because you thought it would make you easier to forgive. He nodded once. Yes. I moved toward the door. I am not here to forgive you. His voice cracked behind me. Olivia. Please. No. You do not get please. You had 15 years for please. What you get now is truth. I turned back one last time. I spent half my life trying to become strong enough that no one could ever leave me like you did. Do you know the worst part? I became excellent at surviving and terrible at being loved. That is what your cowardice cost. He cried then, the first time I had ever seen it. Not dramatic. Just a man too old to outrun the person he had been. I left him there. Driving back to Boston that night, I realized something I had not been ready to admit before. I could destroy Rebecca Hayes. I had the evidence, the power, the legal skill, and every emotional reason in the world. But the person who had truly broken my family was not the woman I hated. It was the man who let me hate her. And somehow, that made the choice ahead even harder. People think revenge arrives as a moment, a slammed door, a ruined reputation. A speech delivered with perfect clarity while the guilty person stands there finally understanding what they destroyed. But real revenge is rarely cinematic. Most of the time, it is a decision made quietly in an office with fluorescent lights and too much paperwork, where you realize you have the power to ruin someone and must decide what kind of person that makes you. By the time I reached the final hearing for Rebecca's case, I understood something I had resisted for years. Destruction is easy. Living with what you have done is much harder. The board hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning in Chicago. Not a courtroom, but close enough to one for everyone involved to perform like it was. 12 board members sat around a polished conference table pretending morality had never once competed with ambition inside those walls. Andrew Collins wore the expression of a man already congratulating himself. Rebecca sat at the far end in a navy suit, composed but pale, while Ethan stood near the back of the room like someone trying to protect a house during a storm by standing in front of it with his bare hands. I arrived 10 minutes early with 3 binders, 2 forensic accounting reports, and the kind of calm that usually means someone is about to lose. Andrew smiled when he saw me, the way men do when they mistake a woman's silence for uncertainty. Miss Carter, I understand emotions are high, but this is a church matter, not a dramatic legal production. I smiled back because arrogance is always easier to dismantle when it introduces itself first. Then you should have behaved like it was a church matter, Mr. Collins, and not a corporate coup. The room went very still. For the next 2 hours, I did what I had spent my entire adult life learning to do. I took apart a lie piece by piece until everyone in the room had to watch its architecture collapse. The missing funds had never been stolen. Emergency transfers were authorized verbally during the winter shelter crisis. Collins had intentionally withheld supporting documentation from the audit packet. He had pressured the former treasurer to remain silent and selectively leaked partial records to donors and media to force a leadership vote before spring expansion. I placed emails on the table. Bank records, signed affidavits, timelines so precise they left nowhere for performance to hide. By the time I finished, Andrew was no longer smiling. He tried outrage first, then technicalities. Then the final refuge of men like him, righteous indignation. He said the church needed stronger leadership. He said Rebecca had become too emotionally attached to legacy. He said difficult decisions are often misunderstood by people who mistake sentiment for governance. I leaned forward and said the one thing that mattered. You did not expose corruption. You manufactured it because you wanted power and thought moral language would make greed look holy. No one defended him after that. The board voted within the hour. Andrew was removed pending formal investigation. Rebecca was cleared publicly of financial misconduct. The donors were notified. The press statement was drafted before lunch. Just like that, the scandal that had threatened to end her life's work turned and consumed the man who created it. Justice is often less dramatic than people expect. Sometimes it is just a room full of people finally forced to stop pretending. When it was over, Ethan found me outside in the church courtyard where late spring had finally started softening Chicago. For a moment, he just stood there looking at me like he was trying to memorize the fact that I was still standing with him and not against him. You saved her, he said. I shook my head. No. I saved the truth. Those are not always the same thing. He stepped closer. And us? That was the harder question. I looked at him, at the man who had never lied to me, never manipulated me, never asked me to be less complicated so he could love me more easily. I had spent so much time trying not to become my parents that I almost let fear make the choice for me. I love you, Ethan. But love is not a pardon. It does not erase history. He nodded. I know. I took a breath. Then hear this clearly. I am not marrying into silence. I am not spending the next 30 years smiling through unspoken resentment at holiday dinners. If we do this, we do it with boundaries. Real ones. Your mother does not become my absolution project. Your family does not get access to me because survival made them sentimental. He smiled then, tired and relieved. That sounds suspiciously like the woman I asked to marry me. Good, I said. She is expensive. He laughed. And just like that, some part of the future returned. Rebecca asked to meet me alone the next evening. She chose a small chapel attached to the church, quiet and almost empty except for the low gold light from the stained glass windows. It felt appropriate. Some conversations belong in places built for confession. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in the front pew with her hands folded like prayer and regret had finally become the same gesture. I sat beside her, but not too close. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I kept trying to write the perfect apology to you. Every version sounded like I was trying to earn forgiveness instead of telling the truth. So I decided not to write one. That was probably wise." She nodded. "I am sorry for the life your mother had to survive because of me. I am sorry for the girl you became because silence was easier for the adults around you than honesty. I am sorry I let your father's cowardice become your inheritance." There it was. No excuses. No spiritual packaging. Just guilt standing upright. I stared at the altar for a long moment before answering. "Do you know what I realized this week? If I destroyed you, truly destroyed you, it would last maybe a year. Headlines fade, people recover, shame gets repainted into testimony. But living every day knowing the daughter of the woman your choices hurt was the person who saved your name, that lasts." Her voice broke on the next breath. "Yes, good." I turned to face her fully for the first time. "Because that is your punishment. Not scandal. Not disgrace. You live. You keep preaching forgiveness every Sunday, and every time you say the word grace, you remember what it cost other people. You remember my mother. You remember me. You remember that I had every reason to let you fall, and chose not to." Tears slipped down her face then, quiet and unperformed. I said the final thing as clearly as I had ever said anything in my life. "Destroying you would have been easy. Living with what you did to us, that will be your real sentence." She did not ask for absolution. That was the first reason I believed she understood. 2 weeks later, she drove with me to Connecticut to see my mother. That might have been the hardest meeting of all. My mother opened the door wearing jeans and one of her old gardening shirts, looking like a woman who had long ago learned not to expect dramatic visitors. When she saw Rebecca standing beside me, something unreadable crossed her face. Not anger, not surprise. More like recognition arriving late. I told her we needed to talk. We sat at the same kitchen table where my father once taught me how to balance a checkbook and later taught me how abandonment sounds. Funny how ordinary furniture survives extraordinary damage. Rebecca did not defend herself. She told the truth. All of it. About my father. About her silence. About how shame had disguised itself as wisdom for too many years. When she finished, my mother sat quietly, hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold. Finally, she looked at Rebecca and said something I will never forget. "I do not need your guilt. I need your honesty to mean something after today." Rebecca nodded, crying openly now. "It will." My mother took a slow breath. "Then spend the rest of your life proving your apology deserves to exist." That was it. No dramatic forgiveness, no embrace, just a sentence stronger than punishment. And somehow, it was enough. Ethan and I were married that October in a small ceremony in Vermont with red leaves falling like the world was trying too hard to be symbolic. My mother cried. Ethan cried. I did not. At least not until the vows, and then I ruined years of professional reputation in under 30 seconds. Rebecca attended quietly, seated in the back beside my mother, not because everything was healed, but because healing and permission are not always the same thing. My father was invited. He came. We were polite. Sometimes adulthood is just choosing peace over reenactment. Marriage did not erase history. It gave it a place to stop controlling the future. There is a photograph from that day on the bookshelf in my living room. Ethan smiling like joy surprised him. My mother holding my hand too tightly. Me looking like someone who finally understood that love is not the absence of damage, but the decision to build anyway. People ask sometimes if I forgave Rebecca Hayes. I tell them forgiveness is the wrong word. I did not excuse her. I did not forget. I did not hand back the years my mother lost or the girl I had to become to survive them. What I did was choose not to let hatred be the final author of my life. Revenge would have ended her. Forgiveness made her live with it. And somehow, that hurt more.